Everybody, and welcome to Intro to Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies. I'm happy you all are here. Know that our conversations will be structured like this each week. I'll post a video such as this on the Google Classroom board. You all will read the readings that are listed on the syllabus for that particular week and then respond to the questions that I post on the Google Classroom. And let this video and the readings guide you in your responses. So, today we are getting into some key concepts that are going to frame this class. The first being intersectionality. So, intersectionality, obviously, kind of a buzzword that we see circulating a lot in digital culture. We see it all the time on the internet. And know that Kimberly Crenshaw was the one to coin this term, and intersectionality refers to how oppression functions in varying configurations and with varying degrees of intensity based on folks' relationship to systems of power. And systems of power would refer to, racism, sexism, ableism, heterosexism, or homophobia. So that is a whole lot of words, and it essentially refers to how we're not one-dimensional human beings. We are, the sum of our parts, and in having all of these various identities and experiences, we're going to experience privilege or oppression in varying ways. So more on that as the weeks go on, but know that full view of how folks are, complex, dynamic, multifaceted beings with varying identities and experiences. That's something we're going to hold on to in this conversation and think about how that relates to the ways that feminist history has not always appreciated intersectionality and really engaged intersectionality in different ways. So, first case study, we can look back to the early 1900s, which was said to be the first wave of the feminist movement. And a wave in this case refers to any kind of point in history where there was a lot of activity going on in relation to feminist politics. So accomplishments happening, movement happening, and when we think about the early 1900s, we look towards how women's suffrage was taking shape. And women's suffrage being the fight for women to have the right to vote. We saw that Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they emerged as venerated figures of that time period with feminism. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were also actively racist. So they were excluding women of color, specifically black women, from the struggle to get the right to vote. And they also wanted white women to get the right to vote before black men. So there was a whole host of, various elements of history that are not always talked about when it comes to women's suffrage and thinking about how that history really embodied how we would understand white feminism today. More on that to come in a couple of minutes. So, first wave of feminism, women getting the right to vote. We had a couple of white women leading the way, and they were not including women of color. That's a key takeaway. Then we move into the 60s and 70s, and the 60s and 70s was referred to as, the women's liberation movement. And the women's liberation movement really pioneered getting women's and gender studies into college curriculum. And as Lindsay Feitz notes in, her paper around, what happened to the women in women's studies, the notion of referring to women as a monolithic category, so understanding women as this category that they all have similar experiences, that womanhood is like a one-size-fits-all experience that had a whole host of problems. It excluded transgender folks, it excluded gender non-conforming folks from feminist struggle and whatnot. And then with that, it centered white women's experiences in conversations in a huge way, which created a very narrow minded perspective for the women's liberation movement because they weren't seeing how, they could build these alliances with so many concurrent movements. So in the 60s and 70s, as you all may know, that, it was a time of, huge social upheaval. We had the gay and lesbian movement. We had Black Power taking shape, and there were so many opportunities for cross pollination to unite these struggles in various ways and to have dialogues across struggles in order to engage intersectionality in social justice. But there were a whole host of issues, particularly with white women in the women's liberation movement, not wanting to associate themselves with, lesbian women that were a part of the struggle, not seeing issues of race as being issues that needed to take center stage and guide the movement in a big way, and how they were engaging in gender-based analysis. So they could see gender-based analysis as being much more dynamic because of those different categories of identity and experience, such as, ability, sexuality, race, etc. So, great strides made, a lot of short-sightedness still taking shape. Lindsay Feitz talks about this in her article, and we also see how Bell Hooks notes that a lot of the shortcomings that happened with, the lack of cross-pollination among movements really hindered the growth of feminist progress. And then as we moved into the 1980s and the 1990s, we saw a lot of privileged white women essentially, losing sight of a kind of revolutionary feminist vision that was possible in the 60s and 70s and really fighting for, a piece of the pie. And a piece of the pie in this context would be referred to as gaining economic power in, a social structure that was bent on, enacting various forms of oppression. So yeah, both Feitz and Hooks are looking to how women's liberation, we can learn from it in a variety of ways, and looking at the various shortcomings of it. So as we all know, it's important to look to history in order to understand where we're going in the future when it comes to activist futures. So the third wave of feminism would be referred to as, an influx of art and music that happened in the 1990s, most often associated with the movement of Riot Grrrl. So this was when, conversations around sexual violence, harassment, gender roles, and whatnot were really taking center stage with various forms of music. But once again, the Riot Grrrl movement has been criticized heavily for not engaging in intersectional focus and sort of recentering white women in conversations. So you all may be seeing a pattern with feminist history here when it comes to, white women having kind of a short-sighted vision of what feminist politics can look like, because they were not recognizing how important it was to decenter themselves in various conversations. So this leads us into the current moment of activism that we see around us, and many would refer to this as a fourth wave of feminism. I'm curious if you all would think that, we're in a new wave of feminism that is doing a better job of engaging intersectionality. A lot of folks would refer to the ways that we're engaging media and digital culture as signifying a new moment in feminism, which there's obviously strengths and weaknesses of engaging so many conversations about feminist politics through media, and we'll talk about that in the weeks to come. A key phrase that we see in a lot of elements of digital culture and on the internet is white feminism. So white feminism is a concept that will also frame our class, and thinking about how, white feminism was not a phrase that was used to discuss feminist history in years past. It wasn't necessarily a phrase that we used to talk about, suffragist history. It wasn't something that we used to talk necessarily about women's liberation. But in, the last few decades, we've seen the concept of white feminism really come to the fore to refer to feminism that engages a distinctly anti intersectional politics. So when I say an anti-intersectional politics, it is a form of feminism that has a very singular focus on reasserting white women's experiences and centering white women in narratives. So we see white feminism in a whole host of realms, particularly in pop culture and media, and thinking about how pop culture and media serves as a really great springboard for discussing what white feminism looks like. And just to name a few off the top of my head, we could think about Hermione Granger, aka Emma Watson's He for She speech. If you haven't seen that, you might want to look it up. But essentially, Emma Watson was criticized with this speech for having a very singular focus on gender equality without thinking about the ways that gender intersects with race, intersects with ability, and all of these other categories of experience, and defining feminism in that very singular way as being a fight for gender equality. We saw that, and this example is used in the Lindsay Fights article, that the Hillary Clinton campaign was definitely grounds to analyze white feminism, in the sense that there were a lot of conversations among second wave feminists like Madeleine Albright and Gloria Steinem pushing young women and pushing young people to just vote for Hillary Clinton to be able to get a woman into office, without thinking about what sort of criticisms and reservations people had about Hillary Clinton's politics. It was seeing that notion of just getting a woman into office as being the first and foremost priority, and, essentially silencing all of those critiques as to why, she might not be the best fit for the job, why people might not want to vote for her. So just thinking about those cultural dialogues that were happening around Hillary Clinton, that's an interesting example of white feminism. And it's important to note that, when we think about white feminism, it's thinking about a particular kind of politics. So thinking about how, that sort of anti-intersectional politics takes shape, a shorthand for it is, like, referring to that as white feminism. So yeah, curious about your examples of white feminism, as well as what you think second wave feminists, so those feminists that emerged in the 60s and 70s that continue to, still have a voice in politics, and, have their criticisms of, people voting for Bernie Sanders, things like that. Read the Lindsay Fights article for more context on that. What you think young feminists, or, millennial or Gen Z activists have to teach, those older folks. So we'll talk about that in the Google Classroom discussion. I really look forward to hearing your perspective, and talk to you all soon.